Luisa Piccarreta, a collection of memories of the Servant of God. Chapter 1, picking up where we left off. The Archbishop at that time, Giuseppe di Bianchi d'Avila, came to know of what was happening in Corato. Having heard the opinion of several priests, he wished to exercise his authority and assume responsibility for this case. After mature reflection, he thought it right to delegate to Luisa a special confessor, Father Michael de Benedictus, a splendid figure of a priest, to whom she opened every nook and cranny of her soul. Father Michael, a prudent priest with holy ways, imposed limits on her suffering, and instructed her to do nothing without his permission. Indeed, it was Father Michael who ordered her to eat at least once a day, even if she immediately threw up everything she had swallowed. Luisa was to live on the divine will alone. It was under this priest that she received permission to stay in bed all the time as a victim of expiation. This was in 1888. Luisa remained nailed to her bed of pain, sitting there for another 59 years until her death. It should be noted that until that time, although she had accepted her state as a victim, she had only occasionally stayed in bed, since obedience had never permitted her to stay in bed all the time. However, from New Year 1889, she was to remain there permanently. In 1898, the new prelate, Archbishop Tommaso di Stefano, delegated as her new confessor Father Gennaro di Gennaro, who carried out this task for 24 years. The new confessor, glimpsing the marvels that the Lord was working in this soul, categorically ordered Luisa to put down in writing all that God's grace was working within her. None of the excuses made by the servant of God to avoid obeying her confessor in this were to any avail. Not even her scant literary education could excuse her from obedience to her confessor. Father Gennaro di Gennaro remained cold and implacable, although he knew that the poor woman had only been to elementary school. Thus, on February 28, 1899, she began to write her diary, of which there are 36 large volumes. The last chapter was written on December 28, 1938, the day on which she was ordered to stop writing. Her confessor, who died on September 10, 1922, was succeeded by the canon, Father Francesco di Benedictus, who only assisted her for 4 years, because he died on January 30th, 1926. Archbishop Giuseppe Leo delegated a young priest, Father Benedetto Calvi, as her ordinary confessor. He stayed with Luisa until she died, sharing all those sufferings and misunderstandings that beset the servant of God in the last years of her life. At the beginning of the century, our people were lucky enough to have Saint Annibale Maria Di Francia present in Puglia. He wanted to open in Trani male and female branches of his newly founded congregation. When he heard about Luisa Piccarreta, he paid her a visit, and from that time these two souls were inseparably linked by their common aims. Other famous priests also visited Luisa, such as, for example, Father Gennaro Braccali, the Jesuit, Father Estacio Mantamuro, who died in the odor of sanctity, and Father Fernando Santo, Apostolic Nuncio and Cardinal of Holy Mother Church. Saint Annibale became her extraordinary confessor and edited her writings, which were little by little properly examined and approved by the ecclesiastical authorities. In about 1926, Saint Annibale ordered Luisa to write a book of memoirs of her childhood and adolescence. He published various writings of Luisa's, including the book L'Orologio della Passione, which acquired widespread fame and was reprinted 4 times. On October 7, 1928, when the house of the Sisters of the Congregation of Divine Zeal in Corato was ready, Luisa was taken to the convent in accordance with the wishes of Saint Annibale. Saint Annibale had already died in the odor of sanctity in Messina. In 1938, a tremendous storm was unleashed upon Luisa Piccarreta. She was publicly disowned by Rome, and her books were put on the index. At the publication of the Condemnation by the Holy Office, she immediately submitted to the authority of the Church. A priest was sent from Rome, who asked her for all her manuscripts, which Luisa handed over promptly and without a fuss. Thus all her writings were hidden away in the secrecy of the Holy Office. On October 7th, 1938, because of orders from above, Luisa was obliged to leave the convent and find a new place to live. She spent the last 9 years of her life in a house in Via Maddalena, a place which the elderly of Corato know well, and from where, on March 8, 1947, they saw her body carried out. Luisa's life was very modest. She possessed little or nothing. She lived in a rented house, cared for lovingly by her sister Angela and a few devout women. The little she had was not even enough to pay the rent. To support herself, she worked diligently at making lace, earning from this pittance she needed to keep her sister, since she herself needed neither clothes nor shoes. Her sustenance consisted of a few grams of food, which were prepared for her by her assistant Rosaria Bucci. Luisa ordered nothing, desired nothing, and instantly vomited the food she swallowed. She did not look like a person near death's door, but nor did she appear perfectly healthy. Yet she was never idle. She spent her energy either in her daily suffering or her work, and her life, for those who knew her well, was considered a continuous miracle. Her detachment from any payments that did not come from her daily work was marvelous. She firmly refused money and the various presents offered to her on any pretext. She never accepted money for the publication of her books. Thus, one day, she told Saint Annibale that she wanted to give him the money from the author's royalties. "I have no right, because the work is not mine, but of God's. She scornfully refused and returned the money that pious people sometimes sent her. Luisa's house was like a monastery, not to be entered by any curious person. She was always surrounded by a few women who lived according to her own spirituality, and by several girls who came to her house to learn lace-making. Many religious vocations emerged from this upper room. However, her work on formation was not limited to girls alone. Many young men were also sent to her, to various religious institutes, and to the priesthood. Her day began at about 5 a.m., when the priest came to the house to bless it and to celebrate Holy Mass. Either her confessor officiated, or some delegate of his, a privilege granted by Leo XIII and confirmed by St. Pius X in 1907. After Holy Mass, Luisa would remain in prayer and thanksgiving for about 2 hours. At about 8 a.m. she would begin her work, which she continued until midday. After her frugal lunch, she would stay alone in her room and meditate. In meditation. In the afternoon, after several hours of work, she would recite the Holy Rosary. In the evening, towards 8 p.m., Luisa would begin to write her diary. At about midnight, she would fall asleep. In the morning, she would be found immobile, rigid, huddled up on her bed, her head turned to the right, and the intervention of priestly authority would be necessary to recall her to her daily task and allow her to sit up in bed. Luisa died at the age of 81 years, 10 months, and 9 days on March 4th, 1947, after a fortnight of illness, the only one diagnosed in her life, a bad attack of pneumonia. She died at the end of the night, at the same hour when every day the priest's blessing had freed her from her state of rigidity. Archbishop Francesco Petronali, Archbishop at that time. Luisa remained sitting up in bed. It was impossible to lay her out, and, an extraordinary phenomenon, her body never suffered rigor mortis, and remained in the position in which it had always been. Hardly had the news of Luisa's death spread, like a river in full spate, all the people streamed into her house, and police intervention was necessary to control the crowds that flocked there day and night to visit Luisa, a woman very dear to them. A voice rang out, "Luisa, the saint, has died!" To contain all the people who were going to see her, with the permission of civil authorities and health officials, her body was exposed for 4 days, with no sign of corruption. Luisa did not seem dead. She was sitting up in bed, dressed in white. It was as though she were asleep, because, as has already been said, her body did not suffer rigor mortis. Indeed, without any effort, her head could be moved in all directions, her arms raised, her hands and all her fingers bent. It was even possible to lift her eyelids and see her shining eyes that had not grown dim. Everyone believed that she was still alive, immersed in a deep sleep. A council of doctors, summoned for this purpose, declared, after attentively examining the corpse, that Luisa was truly dead, and that her death should be accepted as real and not merely apparent, as everyone had imagined. Luisa had said that she was born upside down, and that, therefore, it was right that her death should be upside down, in comparison with that of other creatures. She remained in a sitting position as she had always lived, and had to be carried to the cemetery in this position, in a coffin specially made for her, with a glass front and sides, so that she could be seen by everyone, like a queen upon her throne, dressed in white, with the Fiat on her breast. More than 40 priests, the chapter, and the local clergy took part in the funeral procession. The sisters took turns to carry her on their shoulders, and an immense crowd of citizens surrounded her. The streets were incredibly full. Even the balconies and rooftops of the houses were swarming with people, so that the procession wound slowly onwards with great difficulty. The funeral rite of the little daughter of the divine will was celebrated in the main church by the entire chapter. All the people of Corato followed the body to the cemetery. Everyone tried to take home a keepsake or a flower. After having touched her body with it, her remains were translated to the parish of Santa Maria Greca. In 1994, on the day of the feast of Christ the King, in the main church, Archbishop Carmelo Casati, in the presence of a large crowd, including foreign representatives, officially opened the cause of the servant of God, Luisa Piccarreta.